All right. So good morning, everyone. It's past 3 now. So Shiva has said we have some interesting updates, particularly regarding, backup monitoring and others, which I will not steal Shiva's thunder. So Shiva, over to you.
Thank you, Srikanth. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon for those who are joining us from the UK. So today is going to be like a much shorter version of the call because the team is primarily working on the new agent and the new UI. And basically, we are in beta test mode with a few select partners, basically where we are testing out the new features that we're basically putting in. So far, it looks good. And as I said, in the second week of June, we will essentially be doing a complete walkthrough of the new UI. So please be available for that walkthrough. So I will basically make sure that we have enough of capacity for that. And immediately after that walkthrough, you will have access to your instances, which essentially you can access and look at your data in the new UI and give us feedback. And basically, we'll make changes based on that feedback. So with that said, we continue to kind of keep the current track going. So one of the things that basically was constantly asked for is essentially to basically verify that backup software is installed and basically running on a particular asset. And so we have the ability to essentially right now look at all backup software. And just as with EDRs, we essentially have given you the capability of adding your own backup software or excluding any backup software that you essentially don't want to kind of consider. So we have built up a standard list of, I think, almost like 37 different vendors. And if you want to add some other vendor which is not part of this list, you can add it yourself at a partner level, or you could essentially add it at a particular company level. So this essentially is available. So what this does is basically, once you add these, once you basically configure the backup software, and by default, essentially it is the complete list that we have. Then what happens is that in the asset security and compliance overview, we have one compliance which is relating to backup software, whether backup software is enabled. And essentially, it also provides evidence in terms of what is the backup software that's installed, and then gives you a scorecard based on that. And the same thing essentially is also, for example, if you look at the compliances, one of the compliances that is there from for example, an Essential 8 perspective, is that whether backup software is installed or not. In a lot of the other compliances, it is not a mandatory thing, but we are seeing that slowly this will essentially become mandatory. So now we are essentially kind of bringing this into the compliance too. So you can essentially kind of see that it automatically determines whether the particular asset is compliant or non-compliant. So this is there. And again, whatever we provide there is also basically there in the compliance reports that basically have this particular section. And that's essentially how we are essentially doing the backup management. The ability to essentially look at backup status is basically going to be introduced by a plugin. And basically we're working with some folks to essentially kind of develop that plugin. So that plugin will be introduced into the system, and then we can essentially take it forward. Now, the next one was basically for application baselines. One of the things that was basically asked for is that we have the ability to add allowed applications and denied applications. And people wanted a way to basically kind of remove certain companies from that rule. And that essentially we have the ability to exclude companies, which we've added. So again, you can add exclude companies. And then we have basically CIS checks for Windows level, which basically is checked against and basically kind of reported back. The next one is that one of the things that we noticed is that people wanted to know, like, if I installed a probe on a particular machine and that asset is being reported back, I want to essentially know that this is the particular asset on which the probe is installed, although it's there in the probes page. So essentially we have added a new tag, which is called the probe_asset, so that you can essentially know that this is the asset on which the probe is installed. So that essentially has been added. And again, basically, this is there in the, we've taken it down all the way to the report. So essentially, we have done that. And again, basically, you added a new sheet, which basically reports all the assets other than probe and lightweight agent, which have probe and lightweight agent tags on it. So this way, all IP addresses which are discovered by the probe but do not have lightweight agents or does not have the probe installed on it, you can essentially get that list. Now, we also basically have another view which basically allows you to update any of the company settings. Earlier, we basically allowed you to kind of set the company settings, but then there were requests to basically update the company settings. We didn't basically think that you would update it, but looks like there were a few requests for it. So that has been introduced right now. Okay, so this is essentially one of the things that we basically have added. Now, essentially, we've been able to test this thanks to a few partners who basically done this, which is basically we've added a new field under Azure AD Authentication. So we are able to essentially kind of, you can define the endpoint, which is basically whether it's a US Gov or basically a global service. So this way, what happens is that if you are basically servicing government customers and they are basically present in the Gov Cloud, we basically support pulling the data from the Gov Cloud also for Azure AD CSP and non-CSP. So, okay. So the same thing basically holds good for the non-CSP too. So, and basically we have the options not just for US Gov, but for basically other government clouds also. So based on your region, essentially these things are populated. For example, Germany has its own UEU list of URLs, and so those URLs are separate. So this essentially, pardon? So this allows us to essentially kind of give support for basically both the government clouds as well as, so if you are basically dealing with any federal customers, this will allow you to essentially provide support to them. And we've actually authenticated with a couple of customer partners who essentially have the requirement to support these kinds of government and federal customers, that they're able to essentially authenticate and basically get all the data that they were getting with the normal this thing. So
hardly a cyber. Yes.
Okay. Okay. So the next thing is that basically, one of the things that was there was basically about unquoted service paths. Now, while we basically, I'm just going to things. Okay. So one of the things that essentially was a part of the last week's update that I gave you was basically that we were, one of the vulnerabilities that is commonly seen is unquoted service paths. So there are certain, there are unquoted, there are services which are basically installed with unquoted service paths, which can be used to basically kind of place a malicious executable and then basically take control of the system. So we, last week you saw basically that in the assets, we were discovering the unquoted service paths. Now we basically have taken it to the full 9 yards, which is basically created an event set for it. And now you can essentially get alerted on this. So you basically get an alert. And in case basically that is fixed, then it essentially kind of closes that alert. And the same thing essentially will be there basically as part of the integration ticket. So essentially, if you have a ticket, then it basically kind of puts that into that ticket. And essentially, you also have the other thing that we've introduced is the ability to create tickets for EPSS based on EPSS score. So you can essentially kind of choose like for what EPSS scores you want essentially tickets to be created. And if you basically look at that, then essentially it creates the ticket on a per company basis for all the things with the EPSS score greater than a certain number. So this couldn't be sent through any of the notification mechanisms that we have right now, which is through email or through tickets, basically either in any of the PSAs. So all of those systems basically are working right now. Now, this is all basically the normal updates that we were doing. So basically these are this thing. One of the big features that we're essentially adding this week, which basically I think would be useful to a lot of people is like till now, we essentially gave you this compliance view, right? Which said what is non-compliant, what is compliant, etc. And thanks to a few of the partners who essentially kind of started pushing us down this direction, they essentially, a lot of them essentially said, guys, why don't you make AD GPO policies available so that we can essentially kind of apply these in our system. So starting next week for all of the operating systems, that is Windows-based operating systems, you will be able to download Active Directory GPO policies. We are also working on local policies for the same, but based on what is non-compliant, this particular download, which is over here, will give you a file which essentially contains all of the Active Directory GPO policies that you need to basically import into your system so that you basically become compliant. Okay. Right now, this is essentially going to be only a download, and basically it is not going to be something that's integrated with the patch management system that you basically will think of. But in the future, we expect to essentially be able to kind of put this as part of the remediation plan and essentially kind of roll it out into the remediation plan. And of course, basically, let us know your feedback on it. But our view is that basically once we give you this ability to download the AD GPO policies, all you have to do is to essentially have somebody go in and basically say import settings with the file that we've essentially given you. And if you run a scan on top of your system, your system will essentially show as compliant. So this is essentially something that we are essentially going to release now. And our team is working on basically kind of going through every single control and essentially defining AD GPO policies, which would essentially fix those issues that basically are being reported out there. So we've actually finished a lot of work for a couple of compliances, and we are basically working on other compliances. But the most important thing is to basically kind of walk through this and then figure out which are the ones that are non-compliant and build out only that set of policies which essentially hold good for this particular compliance. So this way, what will happen is that it will help you kind of get compliant much faster, and basically not rely on basically you having to go and figure out how exactly to get yourself compliant. So this essentially is something that we'll be releasing early next week as we are working over it. And we'll be doing it in incremental phase. Maybe basically we'll do it for all the Windows 10, Windows 11, and Windows Server 2019 and 22, which is basically what is widely deployed, and basically release the remaining operating systems as we go forward. So that's basically the updates on what we've been working for this week. Okay.
So Shiva, there's a question from Chris. What about situations of agentless backups like via an hypervisor?
So right now we are essentially focusing only on the backups that we are basically seeing on the systems. But as we get the new plugins, which essentially will integrate with your core backup systems, which will then basically look at, for example, your Veeam-based backups, etc., then we will be able to kind of figure out like, because there you need to know the structure of the hypervisor and what machines are running on it, and then correlate it with the asset data that we have. So we will be building that in, but as I said, that is essentially going to be the piece based on the plugin-based architecture that we are essentially bringing in. So that will essentially take care of that. Yeah, and Lawrence, what you're saying is true, but essentially there is an ability for you will basically be able to find a Veeam agent, but essentially the backups, the way that it runs is that it runs basically at a disk level at the base machine level inside the hypervisor. So it is not inside the machine itself. So it's taking a backup. So basically it uses it uses a technology where it's called continuous CBT backups. And CBT backups basically is just a hard disk backup. It sends a VSS signal back to the VM, and it basically so that it can queries all the data. And then once that VSS is done, it basically snapshots the disk, and then you basically take a backup. So that's the reason you will not basically see a backup agent per se within Veeam. But I believe that it has to register as a shadow provider. So you may still see a Veeam shadow provider inside any machine that needs to be backed up. So based on the presence of the shadow provider, we can essentially assume that it is being backed up using the backup agent. So Chris, that's correct. You can assume, but the possibility that it's not that it exists, which is why I said the ideal thing is to essentially that we bring in this new plugin, which also monitors the backup. So we are working on that too. So perfect. So as I told you folks, today is basically like a very small update because most of the team is working on the other pieces. We'll basically kind of get back to you. And for folks who are basically coming to IT Nation Secure, our team is there at the IT Nation Secure. Please stop by our booth. We would be happy to meet you in person. We have our CEO, Peter, basically, who will be there at the booth. All of our other folks from the US team, Ryan, Julio, all of the folks will be there. And basically, a member of our development team, Malti, also will be there in IT Nation Explore. For people who are there at Packside Beyond, Srikanth and I will basically be there at Packside Beyond, and so will Peter. So we will be very happy to meet you in person. Bob, external scan does not qualify as a does not qualify as an external pen test. Okay, but with the new attack surface monitoring that we are essentially introducing, that will essentially configure will qualify as an external pen test. Okay, so that's basically the difference, and that is what we're introducing. So we are basically in the process of in the final release of the attack surface scan. With the attack surface scan, you are basically going to qualify. We are going to qualify it as an external pen test. Then with the introduction of the new UI, will this include an overall of the reports templates? Yes. The very mechanism of how the reporting will happen is changing. So basically, please have a look at that. Is there an ETA for new assessments besides Cyber Essentials? We basically have all of the new assessments done for the other standards, but the only reason we're not putting it out is because we want to put it out in the new UI, basically, which is coming literally in a couple of weeks. But if there is anything, Luke, that you want fairly quickly, please let me know. I can basically make sure that that gets released this week. Yeah, we have the CIS. It's basically there. But CIS, basically, we have broken it down into like control by control because it's very tedious to essentially go through like a CIS assessment for all the 20 controls at one go. So essentially, it is kind of created as a UI where you have multiple assessments. So it's a multi-assessment booklet. And then you do each of those, and then you save it. And then you basically give your auditor basically kind of one booklet per out of the 18 controls. So one booklet per control is what you will be basically give your auditor. So
I think we are all caught up. So if there's nothing else, thank you everyone for taking the time out for our weekly calls. Your encouragement keeps us going. Really appreciate it. So have a great rest of the day and look forward to connecting with everyone again next week. Thank you.
thank you.